2016, I had the privilege of visiting Israel. I was on my sabbatical and I was thinking what to do. And actually, as I visited Israel, it was actually a very profound spiritual experience for me. Up to that point, I never desired to travel to Israel. But because I was on sabbatical, I was thinking what to do. And this course at Region popped up, and I started thinking, maybe I should attend this. And after some prayer and thinking through it, it seemed as if God was opening the door for me to do that. And so I registered. And I remember the very first evening, the first day of the course, as we were on Mount Zion. So the course was held at Jerusalem University College, which is just on the mountain here. And it's just on the edge of the old city. And it looks over the rest of Jerusalem. So I would have been up on that hill looking over and seeing the view. And it would have been the opposite direction, you can kind of imagine. But I remember that evening, as the sun was setting and the evening winds were blowing in over Mount Zion, I just had this realization. Probably Jesus, many times in his life, looked over Jerusalem just like this, watching the sunset. And I started thinking, I'm stepping on the stones that Jesus probably stepped on. I'm visiting the place that Jesus probably visited. And, I've been a Christian for almost all my life, and I thought about these things. I thought about Scripture, and I thought about Jesus. I've taught about Jesus. But something clicked for me that day, that evening, in my heart, that made Jesus a little bit more real for me than he had been previously. There was something in my mind and heart that Jesus was just an idea, or just a religion, or just something we believe in. But as I visited Israel, something clicked for me that Jesus wasn't just an idea, not just a religion, not just something we believe in, but he was a person in history. Someone who is real, just like me, just like you. Now that's part of what we're trying to do with this series, as I call it, Knowing Jesus, the story behind the stories, as we're kind of looking at the historical Jesus. Now, of course, we're not going to be able to do that because we're still talking about it, right? We're talking about Jesus. But my intention with this series is to help us to try to understand with fresh historical understanding, looking at the person of Jesus in his first century context, and perhaps to open our minds and our hearts a little bit to try to understand Jesus as he was in the first century, and hopefully to therefore open our hearts and our lives to him as a real person who was alive, had a will, had a mind, had a heart, had a body, and has an intention for us today. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do with this series overall. Just a quick review. The first week, what I did, we talked about the historical nature of the Gospels and some of the historicity of it. And so that frames really this whole series and this understanding of the Gospels, our understanding of it. And the second week, we talked about the baptism of Jesus, and I called that kind of a historical bedrock in terms of all historians would just really receive that as historical truth. There's no reason to deny it whatsoever. It just smells like history, as historians would say. And then in the third week, we looked at the temptation of Jesus, or the testing of Jesus. And we thought, one of the things that we talked about is how it's attested in multiple places through the Gospels in different ways. And that also strengthens the historical character, nature of that story. Today we are talking about disciples, the 12, Jesus' 12 disciples. And Jesus calling 12 disciples to himself and appointing 12 disciples. So here's my outline for today. I want to make two observations: the symbolic significance of the 12 disciples, and then I want to take some time to do some application, and then what Jesus did with the 12 disciples and why it's important, and then, again, some application, okay? So very simple kind of outline as we talk about and think about what discipleship meant and what it can mean for us today, okay? So let's start with talking about the symbol of 12. Significance of Jesus choosing 12 disciples. So for those of us who understand our Bibles, who've read our Bibles, and for most of us, we've gone through the Old Testament together last term, what does the number 12 signify? What could it signify to a Jewish person in the ancient world? 12 tribes of Israel, right? A very prominent number in Scripture. So if you know the Old Testament story, God establishes the nation of Israel, and within the nation of Israel are 12 tribes. And that goes back to Jacob and his 12 sons. And they end up in Egypt. That's how the story goes. That's how history goes, is Jacob and his sons end up in Egypt. And there, that's how they start to become a nation, because these 12 families multiply and they grow and they eventually become a nation over generations. And then God brings them out of Egypt. He rescues them from slavery and he brings them into the promised land. And they enter this land. And these 12 tribes are allotted 12 different regions, except for the Levites. They don't have any land. They live within the institution of the temple and off of the generosity of everyone else as they offer their tithes and offerings to the temple. But these 12 tribes are allotted different specific regions within Palestine, within Israel. That is the beginning of the nation of Israel. Now, by Jesus' day, something has happened to those 12 tribes. Are there still 12 tribes? Does anyone know? What's happened? We've gone through the story, right? There's a big thing that's happened. There's no longer 12 tribes. This exile has happened because of the disobedience of the Israelites and their leaders. God sends into the land enemies. The Assyrians, first of all. The Assyrians come into the northern kingdoms, or the northern kingdom, with the 10 tribes who had been living in that region, and essentially destroy them, destroy their capital city, and they exile, take away thousands of Jewish people, all the leaders, all the prominent figures. That was their policy, to weaken their enemies. They exiled them, deported them to Assyria, and they imported their own people into the land. Eventually what happens, generation after generation, these people mix and they become eventually the Samaritans that we hear of sometimes in the Gospels. But these 10 tribes, they basically disappear from the pages of Scripture at this point. So that's why we don't hear about them in the New Testament. But what happens is that there is this line of thinking, both in Scripture, in the Old Testament, as well as in the intertestamental literature, the literature that we have in the history from that time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that when God returns, when Messiah comes, one of the things he's going to do, he's going to restore the 12 tribes. Why is that significant? Well, because for us it's significant because as we think about who Jesus was and what he was doing, intentionally he's calling disciples to himself, and then he points, 10 people? 11? 13? No, 12. 12 disciples. And this is attested in all of the Gospels, and not just in the Gospels, but outside the Gospels, like in Paul and in Acts. Jesus and the 12. It was a very common way of referring to those 12 disciples. Why is that significant? It's representing that Jesus, as Messiah, is reinstating Israel. He's reconstituting Israel. He's reestablishing, he's restoring Israel. Are you following? 12 tribes, 12 disciples. In fact, a very interesting thing that happens in the story of Acts. Now, Judas, right, the traitor, he kills himself. So this is after crucifixion. Because of his treachery, he kills himself. So there's only 11 disciples left. Now, in the story of Acts, or the beginning of the story of Acts, Jesus is gone now. He's no longer physically with them. But what do the 12 disciples do? The 11 disciples. What do they do now? They choose a 12th disciple. Jesus is gone, so he's no longer going to be like teaching them and training them, discipling them. But they still have to restore this number 12 because it's significant. It's a symbolic way for them to basically say, we are Israel. We are the people of Israel. So even when someone leaves at 12, they reestablish it and choose a 12th person. Now, that has real implications for us as Jesus' disciples, because Jesus chose 12. They're the people of God. They're the new Israel. We are his disciples. That means we are Israel. We are the new people of God. Now, I'm not talking about some kind of supersessionism. Sometimes people say, well, because we're the new Israel, that means the old Israel is gone or it's not important anymore. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what Scripture is talking about. There is a place, I think, for Israel. I don't exactly know. Scripture is not completely clear. There is a place for historic Israel, but what the emphasis is on is that we are now the people of God. His church, his disciples are the people of God. This is what God has been trying to do all along from the very beginning of the story. Establish a people for himself. Does that make sense? Okay. Coming back to my outline now. Another verse I want to read out to you. Matthew chapter 19. Jesus says, truly I say to you, in the new world, in the new age, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is on the way to the cross. He's speaking to his disciples, and this is one of the phrases that the early church has remembered and placed on the lips of Jesus. I think they remember it because it's so emphatic about what the ministry of Jesus was about. These 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples, judging them. It's the sense that part of Jesus' ministry is to reestablish and restore Israel. Now, the difference, though, is that how they go about judging Israel, how they go about leading Israel, and their kingship over Israel did not look like what they thought it was going to look like, right? The kind of Messiah they were looking for, Jesus was not that kind of Messiah. One big thing stood in the way. That was the cross, suffering, death, sacrificial love. That's the kind of messiahship. That's the kind of reigning over that he's going to ask of his disciples. But the concept of Israel, the concept of discipleship and Israel going together, they remembered that. The early church did. And so that's why they preserve this saying of Jesus as really a good way to encapsulate all that Jesus' ministry is about, his messiahship. Okay, enough information. I want to talk a little bit about application now. If the 12 disciples are the new Israel, that means by extension, we are the new Israel, as I mentioned. The 12 disciples are the people of God that God has been trying to create. That means we, by extension, are the people of God that God is trying to create in this world. So, lots of implications for us. But one basic one is that our communal identity is very, very vital to our discipleship. Our communal identity, our group identity, our corporate identity together is really vital to our discipleship, our following of Jesus together. Now, we might think that's, of course, that's a given. But I think we do need to emphasize that in our context and in our time, because we come from a very individualistic focused, individualistically focused kind of Christian life and discipleship. So, and just way of life generally. And by and large, these are blessings, these are privileges and good things. So I make decisions about my own life. I make decisions about my family's life, or we do. We make decisions about our kids. We make decisions about our vocation. We make decisions about where we live and so on. We have so many freedoms and so many choices that we choose how we live. And that's just second nature to us. But that's not how communities thrive. That's not how communities are set up. That's not what God intended for his people to be. Well, at least not completely. There's a sense of togetherness and community and one anotherness in the New Testament and the Old Testament that's part of what God is doing that sometimes we miss if we just focus on the individual. Let me give you an example of this in the New Testament. So in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 5 and 2 Corinthians chapter 2, you can read those stories on your own. But the Corinthian church, I love reading the Corinthian church or reading about the Corinthian church because there's all these problems in it. And I think, if I ever am part of a community that has lots of problems, I just read Corinthians because that'll make me feel better about our community. Now, our community is not like that. I'm not saying that. But in this community, in Corinth, there's this one fellow, he's acting very wickedly in a sexual manner. And what Paul says, to deal with this fellow, I want you to treat him like a non-believer. I want you to treat him not like a brother anymore. Essentially expel him or excommunicate him from your presence. That's how I want you to deal with him. I want you to treat him like a non-believer. And then in 2 Corinthians, it's really interesting. Paul talks about the same fellow. He says, receive him. This process that we've gone through together as a community has done what it's needed to do. So now restore him, receive him in love, lest he become overwhelmed with grief. Because of what the community had done, they basically excommunicated him, and he had become so remorseful, repented of his ways, and now Paul's saying, stop and receive him back into your community. That only works when the community is really, really important to them, right? Imagine if something similar happened here in our context. Maybe not necessarily here at Granville, but at some church. Someone's doing something wrong, and they come to the pastor, and the pastor says, well, I think you're wrong. We're going to treat you like a non-believer. Or we're going to treat you, we want you to stop doing these things. What probably will happen? They'll probably pack up the stuff and go down the church, down the street to the church, down the street, right? And become a member there or something. And then life will go on and the community goes on. So there's almost no impact when we think about how we live in terms of our community vis-a-vis the New Testament community. So all I'm saying is that part of what I think Jesus wants when he says, I'm appointing 12, the disciples are people of God. The people of God is what God has always been about, trying to manufacture or trying to create, is a sense of solidarity, unity, community, fellowship. These things that are hard to come by in our society. So how do we do that? I think one thing is just to commit to community, commit to some aspect of life together within the church. So obviously in a group like this, not all of us can know everyone intimately. But hopefully you can kind of plug into some place in the church. So maybe it's serving in the hospitality. Be committed to that. Maybe it's serving in the band. Be committed to that. Maybe it's NMT or even board membership or board leadership. Commit to that. Maybe it's a community group, a women's Bible study, whatever it is. Plug yourself into some form of community and commit to it, right? Raise the level of our commitment. I'm not talking about go all the way and forget about your individuality. I don't think we'll have any danger of that in our society. But just tip the scales a little bit in favor of this sense of our togetherness. Okay, that's what I would say is our first application. So just think about where in the Christian community, perhaps where here at Granville, can you commit in a greater sense to the community? That's the first application, which I'll leave you with. Okay, the second one. Well, the second point, I should say, The second observation of this text that I want to move to now, what did Jesus call the disciples to do? What did Jesus call the 12 to do? Well, there's two very specific things that we had read out to us, especially in that second reading from chapter 3, verses 13 to 19. The first actually was simply to be with him. He pointed 12 to be with him and then to preach the gospel and then to cast out demons so that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. Now, essentially what this is saying, two things here. There's two parts. One is to be with him. Two is to do the things that he was doing. And both of those are important. First is just to be with him. And the second is to do the things that he was doing. Now, if you think about Jesus and discipleship, this is kind of bizarre what Jesus does. He comes, he teaches, he spends time with 12, and then the 3 within the 12, and then he leaves. Like, why doesn't he just stay? Why doesn't he just stay and reign as Lord over this world and continue to heal and preach and teach? Why not do that? Well, I think one reason is because he's just one person. He's just one person. So actually, it's a brilliant strategy if you think about it. He meets with and trains 12 people, and within those, 3 people in particular, and then he sends them out. So it's not just one person. Now it's 3 or it's 12. And the multiplication happens more and more. It's exponential. So I think it's actually a brilliant strategy because his influence is increased exponentially. I think that's partly what Jesus is doing. But the way that he did it, first of all, was just opening himself to 12 people, opening his life to 3 people. And we think about church as maybe just an hour or an hour and a half on Sundays, or maybe another hour, have community groups or something like that. But discipleship for Jesus was, he was with them all the time, or almost all the time, right? So what they were doing, he was doing. What he was doing, they were doing. They saw how he lived. I mean, he ate what they ate. You know, if they got sick, he would get sick, right? That's the kind of closeness and intimacy that he had with them. But that's the only way that he could actually train them and teach them who he really was, and then be able to send them out to do the things that he was doing. And if I think about it in my own life, it's similar. Like, the people who have had the greatest impact on me are the people whom I've had closest contact with in terms of my discipleship, my mentoring, my growth in my life. It's maybe not forever, but for a season of my life, the people who have been most impactful for me are those who've come in closest contact with me. And that's what Jesus was trying to do. It's kind of like, cell phones, wireless charging, right? Anyone have wireless charging on their cell phone? Well, it's pretty common these days. Like, one way to charge your phone is to kind of plug it in, but if you don't have like a plug and a wire, there are these things called wireless charging where you just put it on top of the wireless charger, and somehow by the magic of technology, it's energy transfer, right? Well, it's a little bit like that in discipleship too, that we come, we open our lives to each other, and there's this transference of life. There's this transference of goodness and righteousness and joy. And that's what I think Jesus was doing in this 12 and with a 3 in particular. So, again, application. How do we do that here in Granville? Well, it's kind of simple, right? Simple, but so hard in our context, isn't it? Simple, but so hard. Come alongside another person. Come alongside someone else. Now, maybe you're a little bit more seasoned in the Christian life. Really be intentional about coming alongside someone who's younger. If you're younger in faith, maybe look around and think about people around you. Who's someone you respect, someone you trust? Maybe ask them for coffee and perhaps ask them even to walk alongside you. Right? These relationships in which we come alongside one another, and there's this transference of life that can happen. Discipleship, I think that's what it's about. I think hopefully at some point we'll have a more holistic program of discipleship here at Granville, and that's one of the things I hope this year we can accomplish together. But even in the absence of that, each of us can still think about very intentionally, how do we come alongside someone? Who do we come alongside? Or who do we want to come alongside us, right? I think this is what discipleship is about. Okay. I think I'm finished. Again, I think it's tipping the scales a little bit more towards these kinds of relationships. It's not about just losing sight of our individuality, but really kind of moving towards more of what Jesus wants for his disciples and for us. So I want to just take some time to pray, and I ask you to maybe close your eyes, and I'll lead us in a time of prayer.